When I was 12, my family moved to Oregon. Not the Portland that people know, not the coffee shops and bookstores and civilized rain. We moved to the real Oregon, the forgotten Oregon, where trees grow so thick they block out the sky, and silence stretches for miles in every direction like a held breath. My father had inherited property from a great uncle I'd never met. 47 acres of dense pine forest, rolling hills covered in ferns and moss, and a house that sat in the middle of it all like a wooden island in a green sea. The house was old, built in the 1940s when lumber was cheap and men built things to last centuries instead of decades. 2 stories of weathered cedar with a wraparound porch and windows that looked out over the forest from every room. It creaked when the wind blew, settled with small sounds throughout the night, and felt alive in the way that old houses can feel alive. "Fresh start," my mother said, as we pulled up the long gravel driveway for the first time. "Fresh air, quiet neighbors, room to breathe." She wasn't wrong about the neighbors. The nearest house was 3 miles away, down a winding dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. No street lights, no traffic noise, no sounds at all, except the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional call of an owl or coyote. At 12, I thought it was the most boring place on earth. I missed my friends, missed the convenience store 3 blocks from our old house where I could buy candy with allowance money, missed the familiar sounds of traffic and neighbors and life happening all around me. Here there was nothing but trees. Trees and silence and the kind of darkness that city kids never experience, the deep, complete darkness of places where no electric lights compete with the stars. But I adapted, the way children do, found new routines, new interests, new ways to occupy the long hours between school and bedtime. The school bus came at 7 in the morning, a 40-minute ride down mountain roads to a small town where everyone knew everyone, and new families were curiosities to be examined and discussed and slowly, cautiously accepted. I made friends, eventually, kids who knew which berries were safe to eat, which streams had the best fishing, which trails led to hidden meadows where deer came to drink in the early morning hours. They taught me the rules of forest life, how to read the weather in the way clouds gathered around the peaks, how to move quietly enough to see the wildlife that lived all around us but stayed hidden from clumsy human footsteps, how to find my way home using landmarks and instinct when the trails became confusing. And they warned me about the things to avoid, the old mine shafts that could swallow a person without trace, the seasonal streams that looked shallow but could knock you down and carry you away, the unmarked property lines where unwelcome visitors might meet unfriendly receptions. But mostly, they taught me to respect the silence. The forest is always listening, my friend Marcus told me one afternoon as we sat by a creek fishing for trout that were too smart to bite our hooks. You can feel it, can't you, like it's paying attention. I could feel it, that sense of being observed, not by human eyes, but by something older, deeper, more patient. The forest had its own awareness, its own intelligence, and we were tolerated guests as long as we showed proper respect. At home, my parents threw themselves into the work of making an old house livable. My father repaired the sagging front steps, replaced broken windows, patched the roof where decades of winter snow had found weaknesses. My mother painted rooms, planted gardens, filled the empty spaces with furniture and warmth and the smell of cooking food. I explored. Every day after school, while my parents worked on their projects, I would disappear into the forest, following deer trails that led nowhere, climbing trees tall enough to see over the canopy to distant mountains, discovering clearings where wildflowers grew in secret profusion. The property was larger than it had seemed from the house. Hills and valleys, streams and meadows, groves of oak and maple mixed in with the dominant pine. Every day revealed new secrets, new places where a 12-year-old boy could imagine himself as an explorer in uncharted territory. But it was the shed that fascinated me most. It sat about 30 feet from the back door, a small building that looked like it had been there as long as the house itself. Weather-beaten wood, a metal roof green with moss, and a heavy wooden door secured with a padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "What's in there?" I asked my father the first week we lived in the house. He shrugged, not even looking up from the fence post he was repairing. "Junk, probably. Tools and equipment from whoever lived here before. I'll get around to cleaning it out eventually." But he never did. There was always something more urgent, more pressing, more immediately necessary. The shed remained locked, mysterious, a puzzle box sitting in our backyard holding secrets that no one seemed curious enough to investigate. Except me. I would walk past it every day on my way to and from the forest, study the weathered wood, the sturdy lock, the single small window set too high for me to look through. Try to imagine what might be stored in that dusty darkness. Farm equipment, probably. Old tools and machinery that the previous owner had accumulated over decades of rural life. Nothing exciting, nothing mysterious, but still I wondered. And wondering in a place as quiet and isolated as our new home could become an obsession all by itself. It was Max who first noticed something wrong. We'd gotten him from the animal shelter 2 weeks after moving to Oregon. A golden retriever mix with soft eyes and a tail that never stopped wagging. My parents thought a dog would help me adjust to our new life, give me companionship during the long, quiet evenings when homework was done and bedtime was still hours away. Max was perfect for forest life. He loved the endless space to run, the new smells to investigate, the freedom to chase rabbits and squirrels without traffic laws or leash laws to constrain him. During the day, he would disappear into the trees for hours, returning muddy and happy and exhausted from adventures I could only imagine. But at night, he stayed close to the house, sleeping on my bedroom floor, one ear always alert for sounds that didn't belong in our small world. The first time he woke me, it was nearly midnight on a school night in October. A sharp bark, then another, then a continuous noise that spoke of genuine distress rather than playful excitement. I got out of bed and looked through my window. The backyard was illuminated by the motion sensor light my father had installed by the back door. Harsh white light that turned familiar shapes into stark shadows and made everything look slightly threatening. Max stood about halfway between the house and the shed, his body rigid, his attention focused entirely on that small building that intrigued me since our first day here. His bark was different, not the happy sound he made when chasing wildlife, not the territorial warning he gave when delivery trucks came down our long driveway. This was fear, pure animal fear of something he sensed but couldn't understand. I watched for several minutes, waiting to see what had disturbed him. A raccoon, probably, or a bear investigating our garbage cans. The forest was full of creatures that moved at night, most of them harmless, but all of them capable of startling a dog not yet accustomed to rural sounds. But I saw nothing, no movement except Max's agitation, no shapes that didn't belong, no eyes reflecting the motion sensor light. Eventually, he calmed down. The barking stopped. His posture relaxed. He trotted back to the house, tail wagging again, crisis apparently over. I went back to bed, but sleep was elusive. Something about his behavior had been unsettling. Not just alert, but genuinely frightened. And Max was not a fearful dog by nature. The next morning, my father found footprints, deep impressions in the soft earth around the shed. boot prints, size 11 or 12, made by someone who walked a careful circle around the building. Fresh prints, made sometime during the night while we slept. Probably just someone passing through, my father said when I asked about them. Drifters sometimes cut through private property on their way to wherever drifters go. Why would they be interested in our shed? I asked. He examined the lock, tested it to make sure it was still secure. Maybe looking for tools to steal, or just curious. Empty buildings attract attention sometimes. He didn't seem particularly concerned. Rural areas, he explained, saw more foot traffic than city people expected. Hikers who got lost and were looking for help. Hunters who didn't pay close attention to property lines. Homeless people who preferred forest camping to city shelters. Nothing to worry about, he assured me. But I'll keep an eye out. But the footprints came back. Not every night, but regularly enough to establish a pattern. Someone, always the same size boots, always the same careful circuit around the shed, visiting our property under the cover of darkness. Max's behavior became increasingly agitated. He would start whining around sunset, pacing back and forth by the back door, hackles raised at sounds only he could hear. And every few nights his barking would wake the entire house. My parents grew tired of the disruption. The visits became more frequent. What had started as occasional disturbances every few days became nearly nightly events. Max would begin his anxious pacing around sunset, ears alert, tail low, sensing the approach of something that filled him with dread. And I would take my position by the bedroom window, waiting for the moment when the motion sensor would click on and reveal our uninvited visitor. He always came from the same direction, emerging from the tree line near the old oak that marked the boundary between forest and yard. Always wore the same long coat that seemed too heavy for the season. Always moved with that same deliberate, unhurried pace that spoke of someone who felt perfectly at home in our darkness. But his behavior around the shed was changing. Where he once had simply stood and observed, now he walked the perimeter, examining the building from every angle, testing the lock, not to break it, but as if checking its strength and security, running his hands along the walls, the window frame, the door hinges, learning the shed, memorizing its vulnerabilities, planning something that required detailed knowledge of its construction. The footprints told the story more clearly than my nighttime observations. Each morning, my father would find fresh evidence of the nocturnal visits, boot prints that circled the building multiple times, impressions near the window where someone had stood on their toes, trying to see inside, disturbed earth near the foundation where hands had traced the joint between wood and concrete. "This is getting ridiculous," my father said after discovering particularly clear prints that showed the tread pattern of military-style boots. "Some vagrant thinks he can treat our property like his personal camping ground." "It's trespassing," my mother suggested. On 47 acres of unfenced forest, good luck proving intent to trespass versus someone who just got lost hiking. My father was frustrated, I could tell. The nightly disturbances were affecting the whole family's sleep. Max's increasingly agitated behavior was making everyone tense, and the knowledge that a stranger was regularly visiting our property for unknown reasons created an atmosphere of unease that no amount of rational explanation could dispel. But he was also practical. Rural law enforcement was spread thin over vast areas. Response times for non-emergency calls could be hours, and technically no crime was being committed. Looking at someone's outbuilding, even repeatedly, wasn't illegal. "I'll install some additional lighting," he decided. "Motion sensors with brighter bulbs, maybe a few solar lights along the perimeter. Make it uncomfortable for whoever this is to lurk around in darkness." The new lighting system was impressive. Multiple sensors positioned to eliminate blind spots. Halogen bulbs bright enough to turn night into harsh, artificial day. Even a few solar-powered spotlights that would stay on all night, creating pools of illumination throughout the backyard. "That should discourage casual trespassers," my father said with satisfaction as he tested the system that first evening. It didn't. If anything, the bright lights seemed to encourage our visitor. Now, instead of brief glimpses of a shadow moving through darkness, I had clear views of the man who had been haunting our nights. He was older than I had initially thought, perhaps 50 or 60, with gray hair and a thin face that looked like it had seen too much of life's rougher edges. His coat, which I had assumed was simply heavy clothing, was actually a military surplus jacket, worn but well-maintained, with pockets and attachments that suggested someone who carried tools and equipment as part of his regular routine. And he seemed completely unfazed by the new security measures. The motion sensors would trigger as soon as he emerged from the tree line, flooding the backyard with harsh white light. But instead of retreating, he would simply continue his circuit around the shed, studying the building as if the illumination was a convenience rather than a deterrent. Sometimes he would wave at the house, a casual gesture that somehow managed to be more threatening than any aggressive posture could have been. An acknowledgement that he knew we were watching him, that he was aware of our growing fear, and that our attempts to discourage him were merely amusing rather than effective. "He's not afraid to be seen," I told my father after a particularly brazen nighttime visit when the man had spent nearly an hour examining every inch of the shed's exterior. "Maybe that's good," he replied, though his voice suggested he didn't believe it. "Maybe he's just some harmless eccentric who likes looking at old buildings." But we both knew that wasn't true. There was nothing harmless about behavior that was so persistent, so methodical, so focused on learning information that could only be useful for one purpose. He was planning to break in, and all our lights, all our locks, all our growing anxiety wouldn't stop him when he finally decided the time was right. The thought kept me awake even on nights when he didn't come, lying in bed, listening to Max's restless movements, wondering when casual observation would escalate to direct action, wondering what exactly was in that shed that warranted such intense interest. My father had promised to clean it out, to investigate its contents, but somehow there was always something more pressing that demanded his attention. Fence repairs, roof maintenance, the 100 small projects that old houses required. The shed remained locked, mysterious, its secrets guarded by a padlock that looked increasingly inadequate against someone who had spent weeks studying its weaknesses. And every night, our uninvited visitor learned a little more about how to defeat whatever security measures we had put in place. It was only a matter of time before observation became action, before watching became taking, before our property, our peace of mind, our safety became casualties of whatever obsession drove a stranger to study our possessions with such dedicated intensity. It happened on a Tuesday night in November. The weather had turned cold, the first real bite of mountain winter, and I had gone to bed early after struggling through algebra homework that seemed designed to torture 12-year-old minds. But something woke me up around 2 in the morning. Not Max's barking. The house was strangely quiet, but some other sound, a scraping noise, metallic, deliberate. I crept to my window and looked out at the backyard. The motion sensors had triggered, flooding the area around the shed with harsh white light. But instead of our usual visitor standing outside, studying the building from a respectful distance, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The shed door was open, not just unlocked, but standing wide, revealing the dark interior that had been hidden from view for months. And there, silhouetted in the doorway, was the figure of a man searching through whatever contents lay within. He worked methodically, efficiently, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. Moving boxes, examining tools, sorting through the accumulated possessions of whoever had owned this property before us. But where was Max? Why wasn't he barking? Why wasn't he alerting the house to this blatant violation of our security? I pulled on clothes and crept downstairs, moving as quietly as possible, not wanting to startle the intruder before I could wake my parents. But as I passed the back door, I saw something that made my heart skip several beats. Max lay on the back porch, motionless, his body twisted at an angle that no sleeping dog would ever assume naturally. I pressed my face to the glass, trying to see if he was breathing, if he was injured or just unconscious. But the harsh light from the motion sensors created too much glare for me to be certain. Was he dead? Had the intruder done something to him? Or was he simply sleeping more deeply than usual? I wanted to check on him, to open the door and make sure our dog was safe. But the shed was only 30 feet away. The man inside would hear me, would know he had been discovered, would react in ways I couldn't predict. Instead, I ran upstairs to wake my parents. "Dad," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Dad, someone broke into the shed." He came awake immediately, the way parents do when their children sound genuinely frightened. "What's wrong?" "There's a man in the shed. The door is open. He's going through everything." My father was out of bed and reaching for clothes before I finished explaining. "Wake your mother," he said. "Tell her to call the sheriff, and both of you stay inside, no matter what happens." He grabbed the shotgun from the closet, a weapon I had seen him clean and maintain, but never actually use, and headed downstairs. I woke my mother, delivered the message, then positioned myself by the living room window, where I could see both the shed and the backyard. The intruder was still inside, his movements visible through the open door. But now my father was crossing the yard, shotgun held ready, approaching the building with careful steps that suggested someone who understood the potential danger of confronting unknown criminals in isolated locations. "Come out of there," my father called when he was about 20 feet from the shed. "Come out with your hands visible." The movement inside the shed stopped. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through pine trees and the distant hum of the motion sensor lights. Then, slowly, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was the same man I had been watching for weeks. Same thin face, same military surplus jacket, same deliberate movements. But now, instead of the casual confidence he had shown during his previous visits, there was something different in his posture. Alertness, readiness, the coiled tension of someone prepared for violence. "This is private property," my father said, his voice steady but not aggressive. "You need to leave, now." The man smiled, an expression that contained no warmth or humor, only the cold amusement of someone who had expected this confrontation. "I don't think so," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I'm not finished here yet. You're trespassing. I've called the sheriff. They're on their way." "Are they?" The man seemed unconcerned by this possibility. "That's unfortunate. I was hoping we could handle this more privately." He stepped out of the shed, moving slowly, hands visible but positioned in ways that suggested he was ready to reach for something if necessary. Something that might be concealed in one of those many pockets on his surplus jacket. "What do you want?" my father asked. "Just what belongs to me," the man replied. "What was taken from me years ago, what I've been looking for ever since. There's nothing here that belongs to you. This property, everything on it, belongs to my family." The man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your family? You mean the people who bought stolen goods, who profited from theft, who built their new life on someone else's loss?" I didn't understand what he was talking about, but something in his tone made my skin crawl. This wasn't just trespassing. This wasn't casual criminal behavior. This was personal. "I don't know what you think was stolen," my father said, "but you're mistaken. Everything here was legally inherited from my great-uncle." "Your great-uncle," the man repeated, spitting the words like profanity. "Your great-uncle was a thief, a murderer, a man who took what didn't belong to him and disappeared into the forest like the coward he was." "You're wrong." "Am I?" He reached into his jacket, and my heart stopped beating entirely. But instead of a weapon, he produced a photograph, old and yellowed, but still clear enough to show details, even in the harsh glare of the motion sensor lights. "Recognize her?" he asked, holding up the picture. From my position by the window, I couldn't see what the photograph showed, but my father's posture changed, his confidence wavering for the first time since the confrontation began. "I don't know who that is," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "That's my daughter," he said softly. "My little girl. She was 8 years old when your great-uncle took her. 8 years old when she disappeared from our campsite 2 miles from here." "That's impossible." "Is it? How well did you know your great-uncle? How much did you really know about how he acquired this land, this house, these possessions?" He gestured toward the shed, toward whatever contents had drawn him here night after night. "Did you know he lived alone for 40 years? No wife, no children, no visitors? Did you wonder why someone would choose such complete isolation? Did you question why he left everything to a distant relative he had never met instead of to friends or neighbors?" My father didn't answer, but I could see in his posture that these questions had found their mark. Your great-uncle was hiding something, the man continued, something that required absolute secrecy, something that would have destroyed his life if anyone had discovered it. Even if that were true, even if you're completely insane, that doesn't give you the right to trespass on my property. Doesn't it? The man smiled, cold and predatory. When everything you own was paid for with my daughter's life, when your inheritance was built on murder and child theft. He put the photograph away and reached into his jacket again. This time, his hand emerged holding something that definitely wasn't a picture. A knife, long and sharp and well maintained. "I've been patient," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly across the distance between him and my father. "I've been careful. I've been respectful of your family's innocence in these crimes. But innocence has limits, and I've found what I was looking for." He gestured toward the interior of the shed with the knife. "She's in there, what's left of her, hidden where your great-uncle thought no one would ever look, buried under 40 years of accumulated junk and lies." My father raised the shotgun, pointing it directly at the man's chest. "You're insane. You're completely, utterly insane." "Maybe," he agreed. 40 years of wondering, 40 years of searching, 40 years of knowing your child is dead but never being able to prove it. That does things to a person's mind. But sanity is a luxury I gave up long ago. All I want now, all I've ever wanted, is to take my daughter home. Another step forward, the knife glinting in the harsh light, and to make sure that everyone who profited from her murder understands the cost of their good fortune. That was when my father pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast echoed through the forest like thunder, a sound so loud and sharp that it seemed to shake the very mountains around us. The man, the intruder, the person who claimed my great-uncle had murdered his daughter, flew backward as if struck by an invisible fist. His body hit the ground hard, limbs sprawling, knife spinning away into the darkness beyond the motion sensor lights. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. Then my father was moving, crossing the remaining distance to where the man lay, shotgun still ready in case the single shot hadn't been enough to end the threat. But it had been enough, more than enough. The man's chest was a ruin of blood and torn fabric. His eyes stared at the star-filled sky with the fixed gaze of someone who would never see anything again. Whatever obsession had driven him to spend weeks studying our shed, whatever grief had twisted his mind into something capable of violence, it was over now. My mother appeared beside me at the window, her face pale with shock. "Is he—" she began. "Yes," I said simply. "What about your father? Is he hurt?" I looked back toward the shed. My father was standing over the body, shotgun lowered but still alert, scanning the tree line for any signs that the dead man might not have been acting alone. "He's okay," I reported. "But Mom, Max—" She saw him then, our dog lying motionless on the back porch, his golden fur dark with something that wasn't mud. "Oh no," she whispered. "Oh no, no, no!" The sheriff arrived 30 minutes later, followed by paramedics and a deputy and eventually a detective from the county seat. They photographed the scene, examined the body, took statements from all of us about what had happened and why. The story was simple enough. Trespasser, repeated violations of our property, finally escalated to breaking and entering, then to threatening behavior with a deadly weapon. Clear case of self-defense by a homeowner protecting his family. But the man's claims, his accusations about my great-uncle, his insistence that human remains were hidden somewhere in our shed, those required investigation. Detective Morrison was a thin woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darker impulses. She listened to our account without interruption, took detailed notes, asked careful questions about the timeline of events. "This man, did he give you his name?" "No," my father replied. "He just kept talking about his daughter. Said she disappeared 40 years ago. Said my great-uncle was responsible." "And you never met your great-uncle personally?" "No. He was my grandfather's brother. We exchanged Christmas cards, maybe a letter or two over the years. But he was reclusive, lived alone, kept to himself." Detective Morrison nodded, making more notes. "We'll need to search the shed thoroughly. If there's any truth to this man's claims—" "There isn't," my father said firmly. "My great-uncle was eccentric, maybe, but he wasn't a murderer." "Nevertheless, we have to be thorough." The search began at dawn. A team of investigators, including someone from the state crime lab and a forensics expert who specialized in cold cases, descended on our small shed with equipment that seemed far too sophisticated for such a simple building. They photographed everything from multiple angles, cataloged every item, tested surfaces for fingerprints, blood traces, any evidence that crimes had been committed in this space. And they found nothing. Old farm equipment, mostly. Tools that hadn't been used in years. Boxes of household items that someone had stored and forgotten. The accumulated possessions of a man who had lived alone for decades and never thrown anything away. No evidence of human remains, no signs of violence, no indication that anything criminal occurred in this building. But then the forensics expert made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind a false back in one of the storage cabinets, concealed so carefully that it had taken sophisticated equipment to detect, was a small collection of items that didn't belong with farm tools and household goods. Personal effects, a child's jewelry, clothing that had been carefully preserved, protected from decay, maintained as if it were precious beyond measure, and photographs, dozens of them, pictures of children, boys and girls who couldn't have been older than 10 or 12, captured in poses that no child would ever assume willingly. "We need to evacuate this property," Detective Morrison said, after examining the hidden collection. "This is now a major crime scene." "But the man who broke in, the one I shot, he said his daughter disappeared. Maybe these things—" "Maybe they do belong to missing children," Morrison agreed. "Maybe your great-uncle was exactly what that man claimed he was. But that doesn't change what happened here 2 nights ago."
She gestured toward the spot where the intruder's blood still stained the earth. "You defended your family against someone who was threatening you with a knife. That was justified regardless of what motivated his behavior. But now we have to determine how many other families have been wondering for how many years what happened to their children. The investigation expanded. Teams of specialists arrived from Portland, from Seattle, even from FBI field offices in neighboring states. Our quiet forest property became the center of a massive forensic operation that attracted news crews and curious onlookers, and the kind of attention that rural communities never experience. They found more evidence, not in the shed, but buried throughout the property. Small graves, carefully concealed, containing remains that had been hidden for decades. 7 children, ranging in age from 6 to 13, all reported missing from locations within a 50-mile radius of our house. All disappeared over a span of 20 years, from 1960 to 1980, when my great-uncle had been in his prime. The man I had watched through my bedroom window, the intruder my father had killed in self-defense, had been telling the truth. His daughter was among the victims, Sarah Hoffman, 8 years old when she vanished from a family camping trip in 1975. Her remains were found beneath what had once been a flower garden, wrapped in plastic that had preserved enough evidence to confirm her identity through dental records. Your great-uncle was very careful, Detective Morrison explained during one of many interviews that followed the discoveries. Very organized, very methodical. The kind of predator who plans every detail, who leaves nothing to chance. But he made one mistake. He kept trophies, personal items from each victim, hidden but not destroyed, as if he couldn't bear to completely eliminate the evidence of what he had done. The trophies told stories that the investigators were still piecing together. Children who had been taken from campgrounds, from hiking trails, from the small towns that dotted the mountain regions. Families who had spent decades wondering, hoping, never knowing that their worst fears had been justified. The man who broke into your shed, Morrison continued, he spent 40 years trying to find his daughter. 40 years of following leads, investigating possibilities, never giving up hope that someday he would learn what happened to his little girl. How did he know to look here? My mother asked. We're still working on that, but it appears he had been tracking your great-uncle for years. Probably suspected him, but never had enough evidence to involve law enforcement. When your great-uncle died and the property was inherited, when new people moved in, he saw it as his last chance to search for proof. So he was, what? Planning to dig up the graves himself? Maybe, or maybe he just wanted confirmation, something that would let him know, finally, what had happened to his little girl. I thought about the man I had watched night after night, studying our shed with such dedicated intensity, searching for answers that had eluded him for 40 years, driven by grief and love and the desperate need to know the truth about the worst thing that had ever happened to his family. And I thought about my father, standing in our backyard, facing a knife-wielding stranger in the darkness, protecting his family the only way he knew how. Two fathers, both trying to safeguard what mattered most to them, both shaped by forces beyond their control, by crimes committed by a man they had never met, in a time before either of them had lived on this cursed piece of land. What happens now? My father asked. Detective Morrison closed her notebook. Her investigation finally complete after weeks of searching and discovery and the slow reconstruction of decades-old crimes. Now the families get closure. 7 sets of parents who have wondered for 40 years what happened to their children. They finally get answers. Not the answers they wanted, but answers nonetheless. She paused, looking around at our property, at the forest that had hidden so much darkness for so long. And you get to decide whether you want to stay here, whether you can live with the knowledge of what this place was, what your inheritance was built on. We left Oregon 3 months later, not because we were forced to, not because the law required it, but because some kinds of knowledge change everything. Some discoveries make it impossible to see familiar places the same way ever again. The house that had seemed so peaceful, so isolated, so perfect for a fresh start, now felt like a monument to unspeakable crimes. Every room contained shadows that hadn't been there before. Every window looked out on ground that had been used as a cemetery for murdered children. And the shed, the simple storage building that had attracted such intense attention from a desperate father, had been demolished as part of the forensic investigation. But its absence was somehow more disturbing than its presence had ever been. An empty space that drew the eye, that reminded us constantly of what had been hidden there, what secrets had been preserved in that dusty darkness. My father found work in Portland. My mother enrolled me in a school where no one knew our family's story, where the name of our previous address wouldn't trigger recognition or whispered conversations about the crimes that had been uncovered there. We tried to build a normal life again, tried to pretend that we had never lived in a place where children had been murdered and buried and hidden for decades. Tried to forget the man who had spent weeks watching our house, learning our routines, planning to confront us with truths we never could have imagined. But some experiences leave marks that time cannot erase. I still dream about that forest, about the sound of Max barking in the darkness, about the motion sensor lights clicking on to reveal shapes that didn't belong in our peaceful world, about a man with hollow eyes and a knife who had lost everything that mattered to him and had spent 40 years trying to find justice in a world that rarely provides it. And sometimes, in those dreams, I wonder what would have happened if we had never moved to Oregon, if we had never inherited that cursed property, if some other family had received the deed to 47 acres of pine forest and the house where a monster had lived and killed and hidden his crimes for 20 years. Would they have been better prepared for the revelation? Would they have handled the truth with more grace, more wisdom, more compassion for the man who had devoted his life to finding his murdered daughter? Or would they, like us, have simply run away from knowledge too heavy to carry, from a legacy too dark to bear, from the understanding that evil can hide in the most beautiful places, and that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who seem most ordinary.